So we are about to start recording. Suzanne, welcome. And I want to welcome everyone in the future who will be watching this. Welcome to this final Bruce Gallery webinar at Edinburgh University. I'm Lisa Austin, the new pandemic director and founder of this weekly virtual series here at the Bruce Gallery. Tonight is being recorded, and it will be eventually found at brucegallery.info. Now, tonight's presentation by Padma Rajendran is supported by Erie Arts and Culture, by Edinburgh University's Student Government Association, and the Art Department. Now, tonight, I'm also really thrilled to welcome back one of Edinburgh's own, Sohelia Azadi, to participate in a conversation after Padma's presentation. You, dear audience, are also invited to participate, but for now, please mute your mics. Sohelia earned a degree in animation here at Edinburgh in 2013, and she went on to earn an MFA in moving image from the University of Illinois in 2015. Now living in Portland, Oregon, Sohelia is a mother of two, an educator, a writer, and an interdisciplinary artist. And her work will be included in a show here at Edinburgh in October. It's part of the Line group show, L-I-N-E. And now about our speaker. Born in Malaysia, Padma Rajendran studied at Bryn Mawr College and received her MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design. She teaches printmaking at SUNY Purchase and lives and works in Catskills, New York. Her work has been included in dozens of shows, including galleries and art centers in Los Angeles, Hudson, New York, Brooklyn, New York City, and in London. Her work has been featured in New American Paintings, Art Maze magazine, and Make magazine. Her works on fabric combine patterning and storytelling. Her content-rich compositions reference the duality and contradictions of culture and the multifaceted definitions of universal heritage. Now, her talk tonight, Monuments to Belonging, is going to be followed again by a conversation in which I hope you'll participate. So Padma, please take over.
Hey, thank you so much for such a warm welcome and generous introduction, Lisa. And thank you to our attendees, present and future. I'm really excited to share my work with you and talk more about the origins and ideas that guide this work and process. So I will start with this image, and this is a fabric piece that I made in 2016. And I have primarily been working on fabric for the last 6 years for its tactility, its reference to the hand, its reference to the machine, and for a host of other reasons, but primarily because we all have a relationship with fabric. We all wear clothing. We all, seek out soft spaces to rest. Fabric is part of our interior world, our exterior world, and this idea of rest, where we feel comfortable in a particular shirt or within a particular blanket is really curious to me, that it provides both literal comfort and also emblematic comfort. And another big thing about fabric is that it demarcates our comings and goings. It can identify us culturally, professionally, or even what we're doing for the day, so to speak. When we put on different clothing, it allows us to feel a certain way, but it also is that cue to other people in terms of what we're there to do in terms of our function. So in the last few years, I've really been curious about pattern and symbol and communicating a multitude of ideas at once within these fabric works. And this kind of jumble and chaos of symbol is something that I've been really fascinated with. And in this piece particular, there's a lot of commotion in terms of symbol and movement, but there's also this particular structure that's happening as well. And I can talk more in later slides about the function of borders and how this interior and peripheral space functions. So I am including this quote by the translator for the Arabian Nights, because I really see myself as someone who is in between places and in between spaces. And my work originally, I would say, derived from this idea of place, capital P. And I moved around so much when I was younger, and this movement of between culture, between geographies, let me be an outsider in many cases. And when I was young, before I moved to the United States, I didn't think being an outsider was a problem, or being an outsider was an issue. And so I find it really interesting, this role in particular, where one can be the observer and also participate, and this kind of new vantage that comes from being in a particular view. And growing up, because I'm Indian ethnically, and I was born in Malaysia, both my parents are Indian, and also I'm Hindu, I really was fascinated with looking at the cultural art objects from India, and they were also present in my home. And when I would go back to India and visit family, grandparents. And so seeing these iterations of what was considered art object, what was considered folk art object, and how they inform and represent history, event, and also culture. Another thing is where we see iterations of these art objects. If they are in just painting, if they're in clothing, if they're in architecture, if they're things that we adorn, be it our bodies or our interior worlds. And I'm also incredibly curious about this idea of the souvenir and how that functions. And I think the folk art object is linked to that. And I suppose because I moved into so many different places, this idea of not only representing oneself culturally in a space, but also representing the place where you're at in a space is also part of the conversation. And these next few slides are a few images that I think about when making my work that are derived from South Indian culture in terms of ceremony and event. So you can see there's like a kind of platter on the left, and then also a kind of makeshift shrine that's happening, a religious space on the right. And then these two images are examples of partitions, or, architecturally that would be either like recognized as a building facade. And this idea of moving in and out of space. And of course, these are just specific iterations, but even when I was living in the Middle East, there are different, more elaborate iterations of this idea of what is, in terms of a screen that lets you see out and let someone sees in, but you can't quite access. And also the geometric design as well is something that I acknowledge. And then another big part of thinking about protection is symbolically as well, in terms of how I would say threshold or architectural space is acknowledged in terms of not just a physical barrier or protection, but also a spiritual one as well. And this is called kolam, which is primarily done by women in South India. It also can be called rangoli. And it's done every day to mark the day after the space has been cleaned. And it is also an acknowledgement of keeping bad spirits out and allowing good spirits in. And then this miniature painting is something that I think about a lot in terms of this idea of protection, thinking about these walls, thinking about what is allowed to blossom in the interior space and grow. And then also considering, what is being protected against and what is allowed to come in, what is allowed to go out, these ideas. But also another thing that I really love about this miniature is that there is this kind of lapse of logical space that's happening, like the flipped perspective, and how distance is being portrayed is something that I find both comical and fascinating and try to employ within my works as well. And so I look to architecture, thinking about where I see symbol, where I see pattern, where I see repetition. Being a printmaker, I have also am just curious about where I see multiple in the world. And not just in terms of textile pattern, but thinking about architecture, the falsehoods of that rhythm. And so connecting architecture that I've seen in India to even American iterations of fabric work. The quilt on the right is by Nettie Jane Kennedy of Gee's Bend from, I believe, 1955. And so these are things that I'm thinking about visually, but also their presence and how pattern is working within them. And so I also really think about structure, this border structure that happens, and even the performance nature of not just making this work, but also acquiring this work, of buying this work. So these are two iterations of saris made with wax in the resist process or batik process. And while this is, a really crafted technique, what really drew me to textile was the performative nature and how there's this aspect of how textile envelops the body and in terms of a hierarchy of what is the most valuable on textile. Like, we all understand this notion of judging a fabric or textile's worth by like rubbing it between our fingers. And it's also, I find it really fascinating that this gesture also is the indication of money, so to speak. So thinking about worth in those ways, in the tactile ways that everyone can assess and everyone can evaluate a piece on fabric, regardless of a fine arts background or not. And so thinking about these structures, thinking about what is in the border, what is in the center, I created these prints on paper, and they're quite large for prints. They're 38 by 50 inches, and they're part of a sari series I made in 2014. And I really wanted to consider what is happening in these border zones. And oftentimes it is the symbol of, the paisley pattern. And my mother, calls it a mango. And I wanted to really find this idea of why that is. And thinking about the shape particularly, it could be reference to pickle, it could be reference to womb. And so all of these ideas of fruit and womb and the shape that adorns the exterior, to me, has this link to womanhood. And I'll talk a little bit further about that as well, but also indicating these places of rest. This is like a really rough rendering of a pattern of a carpet that I had that I was spending a lot of time on. And then this is in South India. The banana leaves are the site of where you might eat. It's like the most oldest form of a plate. It's biodegradable, so much so that it's like kind of novelty now if you were to have like a banana leaf and eat upon it instead of like a typical plate. I was also really curious about how pattern can indicate region and geography. So for me, this was referencing some of the madras pattern that was really into, I think, I don't know, I think in the 80s, a lot of brands like Polo Ralph Lauren, or, like had this look for the madras pattern. And it was associated with a certain type of person, I think in the 80s. And then, but really its origins are from this very basic kind of regional everyday life, essentially. So I'm really curious about communicating those contradictions and how things have been sort of adopted in the Western world, about these particular fabrics, or about these particular ideas. The paisley pattern itself, the reason why we call it the paisley pattern is because the pashmina shawls that were being made in South Asia, it was cheaper for British India to manufacture them in Paisley, Scotland. So they would take the designs and manufacture them in their factories there. And that's why we refer to that patterning that's typically found in pashminas to be Paisley. And so really, for me, it was curious to like transform and reshape this idea of fruit, perhaps make my own fruit, one that is not, like, think about that kind of exoticized fruit, and like just explore that idea. And so we see a few iterations of kolam, we see, some symbol, and it is, done in kind of a clumsy way. But I am curious about that language, that extension, and the immediacy of that language. And so after a while, I decided to stop referencing textile and start making work on textile, and still reference to paper, but thinking about these structures, thinking about shrine, thinking about this kind of flipped perspective. So oftentimes there's this stacking of information that you'll see. And a big question in terms of my work was really focusing what and whose stories I want to focus on, and what are these stories and where do they come from? And for me, oftentimes you'll see this fractured body, the gesture of the hand or the leg, and that represents almost anyone, but oftentimes it's someone reaching out, or a gesture is something that I consider a lot, and trying to create an interior life in these singular pieces, or reference to a larger idea. And within my work, I love to work with like applique, adding on kind of in a collage style method, but also considering, making the pieces of the material itself. So this is a silk painting, essentially with resist. So the drawing comes first with resist, and then the painting with dye comes second. And for me, it feels like painting, but you can really see some of the kind of lapses where things don't quite line up, which I personally am into. But again, the stacking of information, I think, is really important for me, and creating this idea border, this interior space one can access, and also considering how the border protects but also informs what is happening at the interior. And considering home a lot, I do think about how the one's first home really travels with you as you move from place to place. So a childhood home, the home that you've previously lived in right before you move into a new place, it stays, it lingers with you. And that idea, I find something to dwell in, and not like let go of so quickly. And so references to other spaces, to other places, and then also relating to my present in terms of being near the Catskill Mountains and talking about that. Something that I also is like really on my mind when thinking about this relationship between people, people of different culture, between some tension of race and indication of otherness, and also creating space for that, creating space where that can be acknowledged and talked about. I also really consider how in this interior world that women, especially if they, we're thinking about immigrant households, that women often kind of create this annex of like another culture in their new home, or the past culture, the homeland, and how that is achieved. Is it achieved through language as well? But I think a big proponent of that is that it's achieved through food. Remaining true to a food culture is something important. And in terms of in terms of folk art as well, not just representations in the home of art objects, I really start looking at American iterations of folk art and what that means. So that could be from, like hooked rugs to tall tales, to also this idea of the decorative, of the transformation that is really, I think, so quintessential to American culture, and how we can communicate our identity, our aesthetics through our clothing. So these are some images from the 60s of women adorning their denim. And I really wanted to consider how denim functions as this kind of link to labor and also casual life. It's something most everyone wears, but also it is something that can indicate hierarchy, and globally, considering how denim functions, it might indicate that the wearer is a bit more cosmopolitan in the sense that it's linked to the Western world. And something that I do consider is how for women across the world, wearing denim might mean that you are more cosmopolitan, or perhaps educated or young. But in some cases, it indicates a vulnerability as well. It could potentially make one a target if they're not wearing cultural dress. But that is something I want to talk about more. So this piece is called American Dream Jeans. And we can see that these dream jeans are adorned with like different pattern and symbol. And oftentimes I include this image of water or tree as an indication of abundance, and this kind of seeking out abundance. This is the overflowing picture on the bottom of the left leg. And this idea of this bounty essentially is something that is sought out, and also considering perhaps on the right leg what is left behind, and that is being protected by these kind of two puffed columns that are emerging out of space, but also showing that they're almost inaccessible as well. Like who gets to wear these, who gets to gain access, is a question that I think about a lot. And this is a second iteration of American Dream Jeans, which is quite large. And I do want to think about, the site of offering, contradictions, space for people, where these spaces of access and ultimately power are held. So in the bottom left leg, you can see that there's this kind of column building, and that there's only light for some, just a limited amount of passage into that space. But I do find it interesting how columns and these references to Greco-Roman architecture are really a part of our buildings of power in terms of judicial or education, and really questioning who is allowed into that. And again, this question of access is a big one for me. And This is just an installation shot just to see its scale, and also a little bit of the absurdity of it. You know, it's like this big illogical pair of pants, essentially, that I do like to talk about in terms of the comedy of that, but also the, you know, the what's happening in terms of the symbols and what they're communicating. And in terms of thinking about access and, you know, not just symbolically within the work, I try and think about how fine art spaces traditionally have been a site that has these kind of barriers to it. And either by who's allowed in or who's allowed to see art, and what that indicates, but also this feeling of being welcomed into an art space. So this was an installation I did about 4 years ago, trying to transform an art space into being a bit more of a domestic space and feeling a bit more welcoming to people to linger. And I have a bit of apprehension about opening sometimes. It's not always, you know, rarely is it about the artwork, it's about the kind of social aspect and building community, which I think is very important. But what happens when you're completely outside of that and you want to enter? And so creating these spaces that are intergenerational, that are incredibly, you know, ideally incredibly welcoming to all different types of people, and letting them essentially rest and get comfortable is something that I'm seeking out. And in this idea of rest and even play or feeling comfortable, I do want to think about the type of storytelling that happens between these sites as being supportive of the interior space, and then also how they are in themselves another iteration of a vessel, and how traditionally we think of vessels as, yes, holding something sacred, important, valuable, but they too are also a site for storytelling. And we think of that in the traditional amphora sense, holding wine, holding oil. But I also am thinking about these vessels as holding something just as valuable and sacred to our survival of water, and how that is something, you know, even in the Western world, we're still like thinking about our access to water and still dealing with our access to water, clean, safe water. And it's not just something that exists in another part of the world. You know, our issues with Flint water in the past few years, or even last, I think it was 2 summers ago, Jersey City was having a really big water issue, and that this is something that is inescapable, and that we need to acknowledge and preserve and hold tight. And then another iteration of my work is questioning this idea of what it means to have a migration story, what is belonging, how do we feel about that, and talking to people in the everyday world, you know. And so that's something that I love with openings. There are definitely people that have just come that I don't know and who saw this kind of gathering happening. But a few years ago, I was invited with Habitats for Artists to kind of set up shop and pose a question in upstate New York, and ask everyone who was willing to wait and kind of see what's happening, what is your migration story? And the thing is, everyone has a migration story. So this was happening in 2017, you know, I think at a really pivotal time when there was a lot of rules about movement that our government was setting up. And that was something that really pained me, but also I wanted to talk more about, to show evidence that everyone is a part of this, and being nomadic is essential to our survival, but also very normal and natural, and not something to necessarily be fearful of, but that it can be incredibly generous as well. And this was exciting because it was a writing component, an art making component, and that it was, you know, for all ages. It wasn't like, oh, are you an artist, or or you a young child, everyone can participate in this. And when I do think about the work, I do encounter like this idea of loss within this migration, and really communicating to a collective, and that we're all experiencing many of the same things, even if we're coming from different places, and talking about that tension, talking about that contradiction is something that I find important. And with some of the work that I've done for different shows or art pieces, I do try and be generous with where the work goes and how it can be accessible. And the piece that is on the left is a print that I did for Prints for Protest, which generates 100% of the proceeds for charities. And that's something really exciting, because I also believe that art should be accessible, to own, to collect, young collectors, or you don't have to buy really expensive artwork to have like an original thing. So this was a project that I'm really happy about being more involved in a leadership position, but something to check out too. That this call to action, this rise is something very essential. Another thing that I think about, and I know that our time is kind of coming to a close, but I want to quickly just talk about how pattern and repetition and image is really about communicating to what one might want in their life, thinking about this adornment, thinking about this call to abundance, to prosperity, and how that's essential to kind of bringing that forward. And I think about this kind of breakdown of individual pieces a lot, going from drawing to like printing to applique to a final piece, and thinking about the kind of movement in between spaces is definitely important for me. And this is another little process shot of making pattern, applying it somewhere, thinking about collage, thinking about working from drawing, or working a drawing into clay, ceramic, and then translating it into fabric. Switching things up for me really is helpful and generative, and lets me not get too in my head or too stuck. This is a show that's currently being de-installed in Brooklyn at Brick Arts Media, called Move Me With You. And it is thinking about this nature of movement and migration. And within this liminal space of a hallway, it's kind of awkward. It kind of, has bad lighting. But what's I really wanted to talk about was that as people come in, as doors open, as things close, all the pieces themselves flutter, all the pieces themselves move. And as someone's walking quickly through this hallway, everything kind of moves with them, in response, essentially. And, that I think is important. So I think I have two more after this, but, for me, talking a lot about confrontation or tension, or this reaching out of gesture, thinking about goals is so important. And by goals, I mean this kind of well wish or this dream. I talked about that, the other work, the jeans, they say American Dream jeans, that's part of their title. And thinking about that, this is still a big proponent for a lot of people's life, like they still are wishing for survival, wishing for, prosperity, wishing for abundance, and these kind of basic needs that are very much human, are really still at the forefront. And I think this pandemic year has bridged how like fragile everything is. But I do think that regardless of the strides we're making in controlling COVID, this is still something that's going to be very much crucial and dire to us. And then these are just some images that I am working with some drawings currently, and that is it. I know I'm a little over time, but thank you for viewing and letting me share.
I'm going to invite everyone on this small group to unmute themselves so that we can just have a conversation together. I want to start just by saying that the range of your work and the sort of consistency of hand and all the different sources are just, it's a bit of, it's exhilarating, actually. I can't wait to get back to my own studio. I'm particularly struck by your explanation about fabric, and of course that we're all wearing clothes, hopefully, and we are and the way in which in a couple of the pieces that that accessibility becomes so important, and the idea that in the later image where you showed where people were walking through a hallway, and I was just envisioning, the movement of the body and the airflow, and then the response. It's almost like walking through like a forest or something. And then the idea of making the opening so that your pieces are meant to be interacted with. You saw the baby and the other people lying on them. And so again, this idea of this visceralness, and I'm doing it what you did before too. Sort of, so it's this powerful kind of interactive element to the work. So I'm just going to, I don't know how that ties in my own mind to monuments to belonging, other than, I guess, the idea of that each person who's present in the work has a kind of is welcomed, right?
Yes. And I think, I think in my rush, I didn't speak to all the ideas in terms of that these works are acknowledging everyday circumstance or everyday struggle for many people, and that this reaching out, or this fracturing or fragment, or even this in-betweenness that we experience, that the fabric work is, or all of the work is meant to reinforce this understanding of past life and present life, and what is aspirational. And in terms of women as well, and when I talked about creating this annex of another country or another culture, that's really derived from their labor that is primarily consumed. If we think about fiber historically, if it is made by women, it is something that we don't really have too much evidence of, let's say like 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, because it's been consumed by the earth, it's disintegrated. And when I think about all the other types of labor, food culture as well, like this work that's being done by women in domestic spaces, or traditionally done by women, it's being consumed, it's of the body, it's food that's being consumed in a way that is again emblematic of comfort. It's why you may, on a rain, like I'm thinking, because it's raining right now, it's like on a rainy night, like having a hot bowl of soup or pasta or something really cheesy, it's not just sustenance, but it gives us this this really important warmth that we need from as humans, and that is consumed by our body. That its evidence is gone. Essentially, that work that women are doing within homes, be it maintenance. I think all of us in pandemic were like, wow, it takes so much effort to be in our homes, like to constantly be making dinner, or to be constantly cleaning dishes. I think we're a little more removed from it now as things get lighter, but a lot of these ideas have come pre-pandemic, and that it's so much work for women to bring about these sensations of home, of specific culture, of like that connection to another place, be it through food and language, I think about that so much. And so for me, the work is giving space to honor the migratory stories, or giving space to honor this sense of labor, or giving space to honor these kind of annexed worlds that are hidden. And I think now, in 2021, in 2020, we're really examining who in the American population um, has to protect themselves in a different way, and who, what it means to kind of hide your difference, and in a space, in a kind of way of protection. But how do you also preserve that difference as well, is something that is a big question for me.
Wow. I have a million more questions, but I am not going to ask you one. I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful Soheila, because she had questions even before you started. So go ahead, Soheila.
Right. I mean, it's related to what you asked, Lisa, but it feels like in your practice, in thinking of home, you play with the dualities of, outside and inside. And it's very interesting to see that, because the inside is so much, it feels like it's inspired by your identity as a Malaysian born Indian, woman who lived in different countries, and the inside is the place of rest, as you mentioned, and the outside is the place of movement. And I'm just wondering, how do you define home? What constitutes an idea of a home for you?
That's such a tough question.
I
um,
know.
a good one. Oh, I think in terms of, home can be the place where all your stuff is, that like gives you that sense of home. Like I don't know if you've experienced this, but where when you move to a new place, like, and for some of our future listeners, like if it's dorm room or apartment, or coming back to your your childhood home, it's not until you start unpacking the things, like the little totems or talisman that sort of ground you, that like, oh, they're familiar, and they're there, and they make me, they start the connection mentally or physically of like, oh, this is where I am for the next whatever, how many years, months, weeks. And but then at the same time, it's also the, like, I think objects hold that. I'm preparing to come to Erie for my residency, and I'm like, oh, I need to bring like a mug, like the thing that I constantly have tea in, that's like about my ritual, that it's about getting started, and that also centers me to like another place that makes me feel a bit more, not so much in a different place, but makes me feel comforted, or like putting on a very particular sweatshirt or something that's like, okay, I'm in the studio, like I'm ready to work. So like thinking about our stuff is a big thing. But I think longer term, um, home can just be even a taste. For me, I was so fortunate to have a mother who is an incredible cook, and when I taste something that reminds me of her food, even regardless of where I could be, I just get transported to the sensation of home, not the physicality of home. So I think there's just so many different definitions to that. It's also, home can be a place where you feel welcome, or and I think welcome is another iteration of love, like that generosity. So it's, and you can feel home with other people, and I think we all have communities that we feel deeply connected to, or people that we feel deeply connected to, and so again, I think it's a little mashup of all those, or maybe they're separate, but for me, I examine all the layers and sensations that provides.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, going back to that duality, you mentioned, you played with the idea of genes, but then I see this Sorry series. I'm thinking the Sorry is what you wear inside as an immigrant woman, perhaps. So inside, even if you have a different, you know, persona, and then once you're outside the home, you take on another persona by wearing jeans, which is again playing with that duality, and that would perhaps affect the way one would describe what home is, right?
Yeah, I definitely think about that performative aspect of being within home and out of home, and that perhaps for some, and even in different stages of our lives, the performance might be inside a home, or and the true one's self that they're becoming might be a bit more free outside of the home. There's, and I think that is part of the tension or part of the contradiction, and like the truth of the matter is really that there are different times when we acknowledge that our family home is a space of comfort, um, or perhaps our family home is a space that has its limitations. And then as we get older, when we experience the family home after maybe, it really depends on who you are, but it can still have that limitation, but it also provides this other kind of contradictory comfort, this reminder of childhood, if it was positive or negative. And so, yeah, I think that performative aspect, and even how we wear clothes too, the sari, I didn't go into great detail about it, but it's all about this drape that comes off the shoulder, and that's like what that pattern is like why people buy the sari. So it's not so much like, oh, what you're wearing as if it's like front and center, but it's what's happening in terms of how it goes around your body, and then as you are leaving or walking away, and what that pattern is representing or looking like. And that I think is really fascinating as
Right.
well.
And maybe not just the pattern, because when I think of Sorry, I think of this fabric that is very loose, and it sort of drips, and it has so much movement, versus jeans that is stiff, and doesn't have much movement, again playing with that duality.
Yeah, and how the body is enveloped and supported in both those you know pieces, like in jeans or in sari or cultural dress. I think is important to note as well, like, and what that indicates, for the wearer.
Right. And I have a question. I mean, there are so many amazing symbols in your work that one can tell mostly have been inspired by South Asian culture, but there are um, uh, body parts, right? Mostly hands that we see, and you briefly mentioned that during your presentation. But I'm just thinking, mainly because you talk about women in your work and narrating their stories, and I'm thinking, um, we we really don't see the bodies themselves, other than the hands, but we see suggestions of the human body, right? With the sari, with the jeans, with, I've seen just hand holding broom, doing the domestic labor. And are we to think and assume those are the hands of women?
Um, I Not always, perhaps mostly, but for me, it's important that these hands are, have color. These hands are of figures of color, and that highlighting this, their their place of action, of highlighting, like bringing evidence to their existence in a fine art realm is really important to me. Not that I'm not saying that, that these hands are doing the labor, and that's what they're doing, and meant to do, but that I want to fully acknowledge and give space and honor these the hands that are doing these tasks, because
Mhm.
they are genuinely working so hard, and that it doesn't get proper treatment, or it doesn't get proper space of, um, I know I've said acknowledgement, but it's true. I think that this is sort of this kind of labor, this type of action, this kind of even love language is something that is almost expected in some cases. And I definitely want to give space to how nuanced and complicated and learned this type of action and knowledge is, that um, it's so complex to me and layered, um, and something that I think is evidence in in these actions over time, in terms of like the bowl of fruit, or the kind of the cutting of fruit, or the preparation of a meal, or this tending of house, this care. All of this is in support of the body. All of this is in support of not just her body, but those around her. and
Mhm.
and that, I think, is the thing that I'm highlighting.
Sure, 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 sure. Yeah, thank you. Um, do I have time for more questions?
Yes, exactly. I would totally love Maria Letterman, you Kelly. Yes, the thing, that maintenance, this idea of maintenance, and the sanitary worker, like, who is being acknowledged, and how is this labor really being emphasized, and all the iterations. I love her work. So thanks for bringing that up, Lisa.
Well, I was hoping actually, because again, thinking of the students, that's why I typed it in, because I'm not sure she's as well known as she needs to be or should be. But I'm wondering if both of you could comment on this work in relation to your own, or in other words, because one of the things you talked about, Padma, was the idea of souvenir, and then you spoke a lot about the, again, the labor. And I'm just wondering, do you see, is there a performative aspect of your work that ties into that? Do you, when you think, like you mentioned, putting on a certain sweatshirt at the studio, I mean, is it like going to work? I don't know, like, is it, maybe it's not something that's necessarily visible to the viewer. I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but if you could expound a little bit on how you're seeing your work related to hers, and then we do have time for another question.
Okay. In terms of when I first encountered her work, it kind of opened this doorway into a Western example of a woman too, in the like of this other time, um, highlighting through her motherhood, through her labor in the home, that it's like a constant, um, like a constant application of her efforts, and that doesn't necessarily get anywhere. It's being completely consumed. And that readdressing, it's something, like, okay, you empty something and it fills back up, you empty it, it's this idea of, yes, maintenance, of washing, of this really basic thing that we need as all human beings, but that it needs to have space to be fully acknowledged how complicated this is. And
Let me just jump in and say, because that's what ties back into what you're describing. I'd never heard of that before, but the drawing, the chalk drawing symbolizing that it's been, it's sort of almost like nowadays when you go to the hotel, they'll have a seal over something. This is sort of like a drawn seal.
Yeah, and it's in terms of like, okay, we see its function as in like, okay, it's cleaning space in a area that is, very dusty and dirty. It's making a home presentable, but it also has this other function in ritual and in spirit, where it is keeping, in terms of keeping clean, it's like that kind of cleanliness is close to godliness, or it's like in preserving a site, preserving a space, you are also bringing forward these good things towards you, or that's the intention. You're keeping out the bad and keeping the desirable. And so I consider that a lot, because I mean, think about, this maintenance too. If you don't maintain, it brings about illness, disease, or possibly even like further kind of linked to hunger, all of these things that we don't want, that are really essential to our survival. And we see them more as task. We don't see them in terms of the larger picture all the time. And that, I think, is part of the modern world. But this idea of this dailiness or this ritual of it, I think embeds it with a little bit more, a different kind of meaning, and something to be savored and acknowledged. And I talk about kolam as being, just one iteration of this type of ritual, but I've seen other cultures have this type of ritual as well, and that, I think, is really important to me, to connect that these aspects, while I'm speaking from my personal experience, I see them live in the universal. I see them live across other peoples or different geographies, and that, I think, is really essential, that people can feel that they see something and I can identify with it personally, or culturally, or even just connect to a sensation that they experience if they are in front of the work.
Right. I have one last question, if that's cool. I mean, I'm thinking about, immigrant lives, and thinking about, being away from home, and how the generational shifts sort of in what one way, sort of forces people to lose language, to lose culture, and at times family history. And I'm thinking about language, and I saw that on your website, and I'm just wondering if and how you address language and the loss of language in your work.
That is something that I am actively trying to address now, and I'm still working on it. I'm still figuring it out. But in terms of this loss of language, right now it is existing as a question for me, and I don't necessarily have the answer yet. But it's one that I've been thinking about for, I would say, 3 or 4 years, and um, a lot of that has to do with how the symbols function and how the work functions, that it can speak beyond, or my goal is that it can speak beyond language, that it can connect someone visually to an understanding in many, I don't know, as a museum educator, I've also really spent time looking at what is presented in the Western canon, and thinking about glyph, and thinking about the kind of codices and how this arrangement of language is relating. And thanks, Lisa, for posing this question. But in terms of loss
Right.
of language, I mean loss of like mother tongue or loss of cultural language.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I have one last question, if you guys don't mind. I'm just wondering, when I posed the question about home, for me as an immigrant who moved a lot within the US too, I'm thinking, home is the place that I feel safe. And you also somewhat touched upon that. And I'm thinking the way you visualize home in your works are, to me, very romantic. And I'm thinking about for somebody who didn't have that privilege to grow up in a safe home, in a place that they would feel comfortable in, how do you hope they would respond to your work?
I think in terms of the work itself, in terms of like kind of the object becomes like it almost has talismanic property. I mentioned the word talisman earlier, but that any object that is either held or around, that it becomes this kind of, I would say, yeah, a kind of a figurative comfort, or this emblematic comfort, even if it's not providing that kind of comfort of safety, the environment as well. And that, I think many people have that kind of thing that is toted around with them, that kind of establishes a sensation of that, be it, I think about like the bag a lot, like the physical thing that we carry, that we're carrying all our stuff in. I think about, the thing that is on the floor, or it could be on the wall, the place where our bodies rest. And while rest is not always something that is easeful, it might be really complicated, finding those things where we can find rest. So it might be, rest might be a musical thing, or rest might be eating that favorite food, and so that, I think, it's always done in piecemeal for me. And I agree that these kind of carving out of these spaces is ideal. And I think for some of the later work is that, and I didn't go into it because the talk is sort of short, but thinking about this hiding space is something that I've been considering a lot, and thinking about these walls and what comes in, what comes out, and what's not allowed to come in and what's not allowed to come out. And this idea of hiding space is either for the individual, or for a group of people. And
Sure.
and yeah, that's, I think, becoming more discussed, how you make yourself felt in the world, or how, I mean, the reality is how many people make themselves small in the world to escape that kind of notice. And Lisa, you talked about glyph. I meant like hieroglyph. Yeah, that idea. And I'm noticing that my light is changing so rapidly. So sorry about that. It's that time of year, like, oh, I just didn't put the lights on when I started.
I think it's actually very related to what we're talking about, the home inside, outside.
I think it's beautiful too. And I want to thank you both for so much for your conversation tonight, and Suzanne Winterberger for joining us. I'm looking forward to chatting with her later about all of this, but I just, it was really rich, beautiful end to our semester here at Edinburgh, and I thank you both very much, and I look forward to learning more about your work. And Padma, I hope that I run into you over at Loveland Hall when you're here in your residency. And thank you again, and we'll wave goodbye now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, Sohelia. And
Thank
it was
you.
really so great to have this conversation with you in such a casual and generative way. And thank you, Suzanne, for attending and coming. Much appreciated.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.